Here's something that might stop you cold. Of all the 10 commandments, there is exactly one that begins with the word remember. Not do not murder, not do not steal. The one God felt the need to preface with remember is the Sabbath. And according to Bible Hub's analysis, that word is there precisely because God anticipated this would be the commandment most likely to be forgotten or replaced. Today, we're doing a deep theological dive into why rejecting Saturday Shabbat is understood by many as turning away from God's own established day of rest. We're going to unpack what Genesis 2 and Isaiah 58 actually say, why this is framed as a deception that obscures the meaning of creation and redemption, and how the rest accomplished at the cross connects to all of it. By the end of this episode, you'll have a clearer picture of what's really at stake in this debate, and why it's about far more than a calendar preference. I've got someone here who has really dug into the biblical and theological layers of this, and I want to start right at the foundation. Walk me back to the very beginning. What does Genesis 2 actually establish about the Sabbath?
So Genesis 2, Yeast 2:3 is where it all starts, and the language is incredibly precise. It says God finished his work on the seventh day, he rested, he blessed the seventh day, and he sanctified it. 3 distinct verbs: rested, blessed, sanctified. And according to a Sermon Central sermon by Pastor David Dunn, those 3 verbs are doing enormous theological work.
Break those down for me.
Sure. Rested, not because God was tired, but to delight in his finished creation and to be present with the people he had just made. Blessed, he poured joy and favor into the day itself, not just into the people or the creation, but into the time. And sanctified, he set it apart for a holy purpose. That's a remarkable thing to do to a unit of time.
So God is essentially consecrating time itself.
Exactly. And here's what's critical for the whole conversation we're having today. This happened before there was a Jewish nation, before Mount Sinai, before the fall of humanity. The Sabbath is pre-sin, pre-nation, pre-law-giving. David Dunn makes this comparison. We don't call marriage a Jewish institution just because Adam and Eve were the first to wed. The Sabbath belongs to all of humanity in the same way.
That's actually a really striking reframe, because I think a lot of people assume the Sabbath is just a Jewish ceremonial law that Christians aren't bound by.
Right, and that assumption is exactly what the theological argument we're exploring today pushes back against hard. The Sabbath is woven into the fabric of creation itself. It's not a Mosaic addition, it's a creation ordinance. And when you understand that, rejecting it starts to look very different.
So then when it does show up in the 10 Commandments, what's happening there? Is God introducing something new?
No, and the text makes that clear. The commandment in Exodus 28 begins with, "Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy." You can't remember something you never knew. God is pointing back to Eden. And Bible Hub's analysis makes a fascinating observation. This is the only commandment of the 10 that begins with the word remember, as if God knew this was the one most at risk of being forgotten.
Wait, the only one? That's kind of haunting when you think about it.
It really is. And there's a dual rationale built into the commandment itself. Exodus 20 grounds the Sabbath in creation. God rested on the seventh day. But Deuteronomy 5 grounds it in redemption. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt and God delivered you. So from the very beginning, the Sabbath is carrying 2 massive theological meanings simultaneously. It's a sign of who God is as creator and a sign of what God does as redeemer.
That dual foundation is something I hadn't fully appreciated before. Creation and redemption, both encoded into one day.
And that's precisely why, from the perspective we're exploring today, abandoning the Sabbath isn't just a liturgical preference, it's understood as losing both of those anchors at once. You lose the weekly declaration that God made everything, and you lose the weekly declaration that God saves.
Okay, I want to take a slight detour here because there's this interesting historical footnote that I think actually illustrates how tangled this whole thing got over time. You know those old blue laws in the United States, the ones that used to prohibit buying alcohol on Sundays?
Oh yeah, some states still have versions of those.
Right. And according to a Word and World academic study by Frederick J. Gazer, those laws were actually a remnant of what he calls the convoluted process of transferring the Jewish Sabbath to the Christian Sunday. So even the secular legal history of the West is tangled up in this theological shift. That's a great example of how the downstream effects of a theological decision can ripple out in ways nobody anticipated. And Gazer's point is that the original Sabbath was never meant to be a blue day, a day of restriction and gloom. He points to Psalm 92, which is titled A Song for the Sabbath, and it opens with, "It is good to give thanks to the Lord." The Sabbath was meant to be joyful.
Which brings us to Isaiah 58, because that's where the word delight shows up in connection to the Sabbath. And I think this chapter is doing something really specific that's worth unpacking carefully. Isaiah 58 is a fascinating chapter because it's not primarily about the Sabbath, it's about hypocrisy. The people are fasting and performing religious rituals, but they're exploiting their workers and ignoring justice. And then in verse 13, God pivots and says, if you call the Sabbath a delight, if you call it honorable, if you stop doing your own thing on my holy day, then you'll find your joy in the Or-A.
So the Sabbath becomes the test case for whether your religion is real or performative.
Bible Hub's analysis puts it exactly that way. The Sabbath becomes the litmus test of authentic devotion. And the historical context matters here too. Isaiah was writing around 700 to 680 BC, and Sabbath violation was described as a persistent national sin. Jeremiah 17 and Nehemiah 13 both address it. Isaiah is linking the health of the entire nation to Sabbath faithfulness.
That's a high-stakes framing. It's not just personal piety, it's national covenant fidelity.
Exactly, and there's a covenantal logic running through it. Exodus 31:13 calls the Sabbath a sign between me and you throughout your generations. Isaiah is reaffirming that sign function. By delighting in the day, Israel signals allegiance to Yahweh. And Ezekiel 20 echoes this. The Sabbath is a sign of who you belong to.
So when someone rejects the Sabbath from this theological framework, they're not just skipping a day off, they're removing a sign of covenant identity.
That's the argument, yes. And the Forerunner commentary on BibleTools.org frames it in stark terms. It describes the seventh-day Sabbath as a perpetual sign of identification, something observable by anyone watching how a believer lives. And it argues that the world's churches have denigrated the Sabbath as merely ceremonial and easily replaceable, while professing to follow Christ, who, by his own admission, said he did not come to destroy the law.
Okay, but I have to push back here, because this is where a lot of Christians would say, wait, Paul in Colossians 2:1-6-17 explicitly says, don't let anyone judge you regarding a Sabbath. Doesn't that settle it?
That's the central counter-argument, and it deserves a real answer. Colossians 2:1-6-17 says the Sabbath is a shadow of things to come, but the body that casts it belongs to Christ. Now, the question is, what does a shadow do? It points to something real. The shadow of a tree tells you there's a tree. The shadow doesn't replace the tree.
So the argument is that calling the Sabbath a shadow doesn't abolish it, it points you toward what it was always pointing at.
Right. And then Hebrews 4:9 becomes really important here. It uses the Greek word sabbatismos, which Bible Hub translates as Sabbath keeping, and says there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. The writer of Hebrews is saying the rest that the Sabbath pointed to is the rest accomplished through Christ's finished work. Ceasing from your own works becomes a picture of trusting his finished work.
That's a really elegant theological connection. The rest at the cross mirrors the rest at creation.
Bible Hub's analysis of Isaiah 58:13 puts it this way. Worship and rest converge at the cross and the empty tomb. The weekly Sabbath shadows the eternal rest granted through the risen Christ. So from this perspective, abandoning the Sabbath doesn't just lose a day, it loses the weekly enacted parable of what salvation looks like.
And that's where the language of deception comes in, right? The idea that rejecting the Sabbath obscures something essential.
Yes. The theological argument is that when you remove the Sabbath from its Saturday anchor and either replace it with Sunday or dissolve it entirely into a vague rest in Christ concept, you lose the concrete, embodied, weekly declaration of both creation and redemption. The sign stops pointing. And if the sign stops pointing, the meaning it carried gets obscured.
I want to bring in something here that I think is really striking from a textual standpoint. The Great Isaiah Scroll, one of the Dead Sea Scrolls, dated to around 150 BC, contains Isaiah 58:13 completely intact. Bible Hub's analysis notes that the Masoretic text, the Septuagint, and the Dead Sea Scrolls all align closely on this passage.
Which matters because it means this isn't a later theological invention or a disputed text. The call to honor the Sabbath as a delight, to call it God's holy day, that's been in the manuscript tradition for over 2,000 years without significant variation.
So the textual foundation is solid. The debate isn't about whether Isaiah said it, it's about what it means for us now.
Exactly. And that's where the different Christian traditions genuinely diverge. The St. Andrew's Encyclopedia of Theology, in its article on Sabbath in the Christian tradition by Philip Alexander, describes the Sabbath theologically as an imitatio Dei, an imitation of God. When you rest on the seventh day, you are doing what God did. You are imaging him in time.
Imitatio Dei, imitation of God. That's a profound frame. It's not just obedience, it's participation in God's own pattern.
And Philip Alexander also frames the Sabbath as a fundamental element in the structuring of salvation history. It's not a footnote, it's load-bearing architecture in the biblical narrative. Remove it, and the structure shifts.
Let me bring in something from a Jewish perspective here, because I think it adds a layer that's easy to miss in purely Christian theological discussions. Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, described by Sola 5 as a leading 20th century Polish-American theologian and Jewish philosopher, wrote something that I think cuts right to the heart of this.
Heschel is essential here. What did he say?
He wrote, "For Jews whose sacred architecture isn't only physical but temporal, Sabbaths are our great cathedrals." And then he added, 6 days a week, we wrestle with the world, wringing profit from the earth. On the Sabbath, we especially care for the seed of eternity planted in the soul."
That phrase, the seed of eternity planted in the soul, is stunning. And it connects directly to what the Sabbath is doing theologically. It's not just a break from work. It's a weekly act of orienting yourself towards something that transcends the week, toward the Creator, toward the Redeemer, toward the rest that is still coming.
And when you frame it that way, rejecting the Sabbath starts to look less like a calendar disagreement and more like, I don't know, refusing to look up from your work long enough to remember why you're working.
That's a really good way to put it. And the Alabaster Strings biblical word study makes a point that I think is underappreciated. The Hebrew word nuach, one of the primary words for rest, appears 140 times in Scripture. And it doesn't just mean stopping, it means settling, finding a place of peace and stability. The Sabbath isn't passive, it's an active settling into God.
So there's a difference between just not working and actually resting in the biblical sense.
A significant difference. And Isaiah 58:13 captures that distinction. It says, don't just stop working, don't do your own thing, don't speak your own words, don't pursue your own pleasure. The Sabbath is a reorientation of the whole self toward God. Bible Hub describes it as rest becoming liturgy. The cessation of self-directed activity is itself an act of worship.
Rest as liturgy. I love that framing. It's not emptiness, it's fullness directed toward God.
And that's why the deception argument is so pointed. If you replace that with a vague spiritual rest that has no specific day, no specific practice, no embodied weekly rhythm, you've lost the liturgy. You've kept the concept but removed the practice that gives the concept its shape.
Now, I want to be fair to the other side of this, because there are serious theologians who argue that the resurrection of Jesus on the first day of the week is itself a new creation event, and that Sunday worship is the appropriate Christian response to that. The Pastors.ai devotional on the Sabbath argues that the transition to the Lord's Day is grounded in the resurrection, and that it marks the completion of redemption.
That's a real and significant theological position, and it deserves respect. The argument is that just as the Lord's Supper memorializes Jesus' death, the Lord's Day memorializes his resurrection. And Acts 27 does describe the early church gathering on the first day of the week to break bread.
So the Sunday position isn't arbitrary, it has a theological rationale.
It does. But the counter-argument from the Saturday Sabbath perspective is this. Jesus himself, as Luke 4:16 records, went to the synagogue on the Sabbath day as his custom. He didn't abolish it, he clarified it. He said, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath, in Mark 2:27. He's restoring the original intent, not replacing the day.
And he called himself Lord of the Sabbath, which is an interesting claim. It's not Lord over the Sabbath in the sense of being above it. It's more like he owns it.
That's a really important distinction. Lord of the Sabbath in Mark 2:28, the Forerunner commentary reads this as Jesus affirming his authority over the day's meaning, not as a declaration that the day is now obsolete. He's the one who instituted it at creation. He's clarifying what it was always for.
And then there's the healing on the Sabbath incidents, which are fascinating because they show Jesus actively doing things on the Sabbath that the religious leaders considered violations.
Right. He healed a man with a withered hand in Matthew 12, and he asked, "Is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath or to do evil, to save life or to destroy it?" in Luke 6:9. He's not abolishing the Sabbath. He's showing that liberation and mercy are exactly what the Sabbath is for. The Sabbath was always meant to be a day of freedom, not restriction.
Which loops back to Isaiah 58, because that chapter is also about loosing chains of injustice, setting the oppressed free. The Sabbath and justice are connected in the same chapter.
Frederick Gazer's Word and World study makes exactly that point. In Isaiah, both Sabbath keeping and fasting are related to justice. They are not legalistic demands, but invitations to a life of delight. The Sabbath ensures rest not just for the observer, but for servants, sojourners, and even animals, as Exodus 23:12 specifies. It's a social justice institution built into the rhythm of time.
So rejecting the Sabbath from this angle isn't just a personal spiritual loss, it potentially removes a structural protection for the vulnerable.
That's the argument. And Gazer makes a point that I find really compelling. Maintaining Sabbath rest, even if on Sunday, he says, becomes a sign to the world that life is not defined by the never-ending quest for more. The Sabbath is a weekly act of resistance against the logic of endless productivity.
That's a very contemporary resonance. In a culture that glorifies the hustle, the Sabbath is almost countercultural.
Deeply countercultural. And the Solar 5 article by Joachim Rieck makes the point that the doctrine of rest is an overlooked theme in biblical theology that rarely features in theological discussions except when it comes to disputes around the Sabbath. Which is ironic, the thing that's supposed to be central keeps getting pushed to the margins.
Okay, let me ask you the sharpest version of the deception argument, because I think that's what makes this topic genuinely provocative. What exactly is being obscured when the Sabbath is rejected or replaced?
3 things, according to the theological framework we've been tracing. First, the meaning of creation, the weekly declaration that God made everything and that his work is finished and good. Second, the meaning of redemption, the weekly embodied memory that God delivers his people from bondage. And third, the meaning of the cross, the rest accomplished by Christ's finished work, which the Sabbath was always pointing toward.
So the Sabbath is essentially a weekly sermon preached in time rather than words.
That's a beautiful way to put it. And when you remove it, you don't just lose a day, you lose the sermon. The message that God creates, God redeems, and God provides rest, that message stops being enacted weekly in the lives of believers.
And the Forerunner commentary frames this in terms of covenant identity. The Sabbath is a visible sign that anyone can observe. You don't have to say a word. The way you live your week testifies to who you belong to.
Exactly. And that's why the language of deception is used in this theological tradition. It's not that people who worship on Sunday are consciously deceiving anyone. It's that the shift away from the seventh day, from the day God specifically blessed and sanctified, is understood as a substitution that carries a different message than the original. A message that, however unintentionally, obscures the specific day God set apart.
And the word profane is interesting here too. The Forerunner commentary traces it back to the Latin profanus, literally far from the temple. So to profane the Sabbath isn't just to break a rule, it's to move away from the place of true worship.
That etymology is striking, and it reframes what's at stake. This isn't primarily about rule keeping, it's about proximity to God. The Sabbath, in this framework, is a weekly return to the temple, to the place where God's presence is encountered. Rejecting it is a movement away from that encounter.
So when you step back from everything we've covered today, here's what this really comes down to. The Sabbath is not a minor liturgical detail. It's a theological load-bearing wall.
That's exactly right. It carries the weight of creation. God made everything and rested. It carries the weight of redemption. God delivered his people and called them to remember. And it carries the weight of the cross. Christ's finished work is the ultimate rest the Sabbath was always pointing towards. Remove of it, and all 3 of those declarations lose their weekly, embodied, enacted form.
And the Isaiah 58 dimension adds something that I think is easy to miss. The Sabbath isn't just about what you stop doing, it's about what you start doing. Calling it a delight, calling it honorable, orienting your whole self, your time, your words, your desires toward God.
And the promise attached to that in Isaiah 58:14 is remarkable. Then you will find your joy in the Oid, and I will cause you to ride on the heights of the land. The Sabbath isn't a burden in this text. It's a doorway to joy. The deception, from this perspective, is convincing people that the doorway is optional, or that any door will do.
I want to close with something that I think ties the whole conversation together. We started with the fact that the Sabbath commandment is the only one that begins with remember. And what we've traced today is essentially the story of what happens when that remembering stops.
When the remembering stops, the meaning fades. The Sabbath was designed to be a weekly act of memory, memory of creation, memory of redemption, memory of the rest that is still coming. Every seventh day was meant to be a re-encountering. Without it, the drift is gradual but real.
And the question this episode leaves us with isn't really which day do you worship on, it's deeper than that. It's what does your weekly rhythm declare about who God is and what he has done? Because according to the theological tradition we've explored today, that declaration matters enormously.
And Rabbi Heschel's image stays with me. Sabbaths as great cathedrals. Not buildings made of stone, but moments made of time. Sacred architecture you carry with you every week. The question is whether you're still building it.
Sacred architecture in time. That's the image I'll be sitting with. God didn't just make a world, he made a week, and he put something holy at the end of it. Whether you treat that as a gift or a relic might say more about your theology than almost anything else. Thanks for spending this time with us on Copilot Podcasts. The next time Saturday rolls around, you might just find yourself asking, what is this day supposed to be declaring? And now you have the theological vocabulary to start answering that question.